The whispers started the moment Delilah Porter stepped off the stagecoach in Calico, California, in the spring of 1883. But she never imagined they would turn into accusations that could destroy what little remained of her fractured life. Delilah had come to this dusty mining town, nestled in the Mojave Desert with nothing but a worn carpetbag, and the weight of her widowhood pressing against her chest like a stone. Her husband had died 6 months prior in a mining accident back in Nevada, leaving her with debts she could not pay and a landlord who made it clear she had 2 weeks to vacate. Calico represented a fresh start, a place where silver still gleamed in the mountains and hope had not yet turned to dust. She had secured a position as a seamstress through a letter of introduction from a distant cousin, and she arrived with her head held high despite the trembling in her hands. The town itself sprawled across the harsh landscape, like a collection of wooden boxes thrown carelessly by a giant child. Buildings lined the main street in various states of construction and decay, their false fronts painted with optimistic signs advertising everything from dry goods to assay offices. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, turning the air thick and shimmering. Mountains rose in the distance, scarred with mine shafts that promised fortune to some and heartbreak to most. Delilah found lodging in a boarding house run by Mrs. Catherine Wells, a stern woman with iron-gray hair and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. The room was small but clean, with a window that overlooked the bustling main street. She unpacked her few belongings and reported to the dress shop the following morning, where Mrs. Harriet Moore, the proprietor, looked her up and down with an expression that suggested she found Delilah lacking but acceptable. The work was steady, which Delilah appreciated. She spent her days mending torn hems, taking in waists, and occasionally creating new garments from bolts of fabric that arrived on the supply wagons. The other women who frequented the shop were polite but distant, their conversations dying down when she entered the room. Delilah told herself it was simply the natural wariness people felt toward newcomers. That time would soften their reserve. She was wrong. The first real hint of trouble came 3 weeks after her arrival. Delilah had finished her work early and decided to walk to the general store for some thread. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street, and she was admiring the way the light turned the distant mountains purple when she nearly collided with a man coming out of the mercantile. "Oh, forgive me," she said, stepping back quickly. The man steadied her with a gentle hand on her elbow. "No harm done, madam. I should have been watching where I was going." Delilah looked up into a face that was weathered by sun and wind but kind, with deep brown eyes that crinkled at the corners. He wore the typical garb of a working cowboy, dusty trousers, a worn shirt, a bandana around his neck, and a hat that had seen better days. He released her elbow immediately and tipped his hat. "Name is Gideon Jameson, madam. I don't believe we have met." "Delilah Porter," she replied, offering a small smile. "I am new to Calico. I work at the dress shop." "Welcome to town, Mrs. Porter." He had noticed her wedding ring, which she still wore out of habit more than sentiment. "I hope you are finding Calico to your liking." "It is certainly different from what I am accustomed to, but everyone has been very welcoming." They exchanged a few more pleasantries before Gideon excused himself, explaining that he needed to return to the ranch where he worked. Delilah watched him mount a sturdy bay horse and ride off toward the east, thinking nothing more of the encounter than that she had met a polite gentleman. But the women of Calico thought differently. The next day, when Delilah arrived at the dress shop, she found Mrs. Moore and 2 of her regular customers, Mrs. Vanessa Clark and Mrs. Rebecca Dunn, huddled together in intense conversation. They fell silent when they saw her, their expressions shifting from animated to coldly neutral. "Good morning," Delilah said, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling that crept up her spine. "Mrs. Porter," Mrs. Moore said stiffly, "you may begin with the alterations on the blue dress. It is in the back." Delilah nodded and moved toward the workroom, but not before she caught the tail end of a whispered comment from Mrs. Clark. "Shameless. Absolutely shameless." Her hands shook slightly as she picked up the blue dress, but she forced herself to focus on the work. She told herself she was being paranoid, that the comment could have been about anyone or anything. But as the days passed, the atmosphere grew increasingly hostile. Women crossed the street to avoid her. Conversations stopped when she approached. Mrs. Wells, her landlady, began leaving her meals outside her door rather than inviting her to eat with the other boarders. And through it all, Delilah had no idea what she had done to deserve such treatment. The answer came on a Wednesday afternoon, delivered by Mrs. Moore with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. "Mrs. Porter, I think it would be best if you sought employment elsewhere," the shop owner announced, her mouth pinched tight with disapproval. Delilah looked up from the hem she was stitching, her needle frozen in midair. "I beg your pardon. Have I done something wrong with my work? Your work is adequate. However, your character is not. I cannot have a woman of questionable morals working in my establishment. It is bad for business." The words hit Delilah like a physical blow. "Questionable morals, Mrs. Moore. I have no idea what you are talking about. I have conducted myself with complete propriety since arriving in Calico." "Propriety?" Mrs. Moore's voice rose. "You have been seen pursuing Gideon Jameson, a married man, with brazen disregard for his wife or your own reputation. Several witnesses have reported seeing you speaking with him, touching him even in broad daylight on the street." Delilah felt the blood drain from her face. "I bumped into Mr. Jameson outside the Mercantile. It was a chance encounter, nothing more. We spoke for perhaps 2 minutes, and it was entirely innocent." "That is not what I have heard. Mrs. Clark saw you laughing with him. Mrs. Dunn says you were practically throwing yourself at him." "That is absolutely untrue." Delilah stood, her sewing falling to the floor. "I did not throw myself at anyone. We exchanged polite greetings, nothing more. Nevertheless, the damage to your reputation is done. I cannot afford to be associated with a woman who chases after married men. You will collect your wages for the work you have completed and leave immediately." Delilah wanted to argue further, but she could see that Mrs. Moore's mind was set. With trembling hands, she gathered her things and accepted the coins the shop owner counted out with obvious distaste. She walked back to the boarding house in a daze, her mind reeling. How had a simple, innocent conversation turned into this nightmare? She replayed the encounter in her head, searching for anything that could have been misconstrued. Yes, she had smiled. Yes, they had been friendly. But there had been nothing improper, nothing that could justify these accusations. Mrs. Wells was waiting for her when she arrived at the boarding house. "I heard what happened," the landlady said, her face hard. "I will need you to vacate your room by the end of the week." "Mrs. Wells, please let me explain. I have done nothing wrong." "What you have or have not done is none of my concern. What I care about is the reputation of my establishment. I cannot house a woman who has been dismissed for moral turpitude." Delilah felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I need more than a few days to find new lodging and employment. You should have thought of that before you set your cap at a married man. You have until Saturday." The door closed in Delilah's face, leaving her standing in the hallway with her world crumbling around her. She made her way to her room and sat on the narrow bed, trying to understand how everything had gone so terribly wrong so quickly. She had no job. She would soon have no place to live. And her reputation, the only currency a woman had in a place like Calico, had been destroyed by malicious gossip based on nothing but a chance meeting. For the first time since her husband's death, Delilah allowed herself to cry. She wept for the unfairness of it all, for the loneliness that had become her constant companion, for the future that seemed to grow darker with each passing day. But even as she cried, a spark of anger began to glow in her chest. She had done nothing wrong. She would not slink away in shame as if she had. The next morning, Delilah dressed in her best outfit and walked into town with her shoulders squared. If the people of Calico wanted to whisper about her, let them. She would look them in the eye and dare them to make their accusations to her face. She was standing outside the general store, debating whether to go in and endure the stares when a familiar voice spoke behind her. "Mrs. Porter, are you all right?" She turned to find Gideon Jameson regarding her with concern. He was leading his horse, clearly having just arrived in town. "Mr. Jameson." Her voice came out more sharply than she intended. "I would appreciate it if you would not speak to me." Confusion flickered across his face. "Have I offended you in some way? You have ruined me, actually, though through no fault of your own." The words burst out before she could stop them. "Our conversation last week has apparently been witnessed and misinterpreted, and I have now lost both my employment and my lodging because the entire town believes I am chasing after you." Gideon's expression shifted from confusion to shock, and then to anger. "They what? I have been accused of pursuing a married man with improper intentions. Mrs. Moore dismissed me from the dress shop, and Mrs. Wells has given me until Saturday to vacate my room. All because we exchanged pleasantries on the street. But I am not married," Gideon said slowly. Delilah stared at him. "What? I am not married? I have never been married. Where did they get the idea that I have a wife?" Hope and confusion warred in Delilah's chest. "Everyone says you are married. Mrs. Moore specifically said you had a wife." Gideon's jaw tightened. "I do not know where this rumor came from, but it is absolutely false. I live in the bunkhouse at the Double J Ranch with 5 other cowboys. There is no wife." "Then why would they say such a thing?" He was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the street as if seeing it clearly for the first time. "I wonder if this has something to do with the Hendersons." "Who are the Hendersons?" "Nate Henderson owns the dry goods store. His wife, Margaret, is one of the most influential women in Calico. She has been trying to match me with her sister, Caroline, for the past year. I have politely declined, but Margaret is not the type of woman who takes no for an answer." Understanding began to dawn on Delilah. "You think Mrs. Henderson started this rumor?" "I think it is possible. If she convinced everyone I was married, it would explain why you have been accused of improper behavior. And if you are driven out of town in disgrace, it serves as a warning to other women who might catch my attention." "But I was not trying to catch your attention. We simply bumped into each other. I know that. But Margaret Henderson does not let facts get in the way of her plans." Gideon's expression was grim. "This is my fault. If my presence in your life has caused you harm, I need to make it right." "How?" "The damage is done. Even if you tell everyone you are not married, they will still believe I was pursuing you. Then I will tell them the truth, all of it." Gideon secured his horse to the hitching post and offered Delilah his arm. "Come with me." "Where are we going?" "To set the record straight." Delilah hesitated. Going anywhere with Gideon would only fuel more gossip. But what did she have to lose? Her reputation was already in tatters, and she would be homeless in 3 days. At least this way the truth would be known. She took his arm. They walked down the main street together, and Delilah could feel eyes on them from every direction. Curtains twitched in windows. Conversations paused. By the time they reached the center of town, a small crowd had begun to gather. drawn by the spectacle of the scandalous widow walking arm in arm with the married cowboy. Gideon stopped in front of the dry goods store and raised his voice so that everyone could hear. "I need to address a serious matter with the people of Calico." More townspeople emerged from shops and houses, curiosity overcoming their sense of propriety. Delilah saw Mrs. Moore, Mrs. Clark, and Mrs. Dunn standing together, their faces pinched with disapproval. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway of the dry goods store, her sister Caroline beside her. "It has come to my attention," Gideon continued, his voice carrying clearly in the desert air, "that Mrs. Delilah Porter has been accused of improper conduct. Specifically, she has been accused of pursuing me despite my supposed marital status." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Henderson's expression remained carefully neutral, but Delilah saw a flicker of calculation in her eyes. "I want to make something absolutely clear," Gideon said. "I am not married. I have never been married. I do not have a wife waiting for me anywhere. The rumor that I am a married man is completely and utterly false." The murmurs grew louder. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her voice syrupy sweet. "Mr. Jameson, I think there has been a misunderstanding. No one said you were married." "That is exactly what Mrs. Moore told me," Delilah interjected, finding her voice. "She said I was dismissed because I was pursuing a married man. She specifically mentioned Mr. Jameson and his wife." Mrs. Moore flushed red. "I was simply repeating what I had heard from reliable sources." "And who were these reliable sources?" Gideon asked, his tone challenging. Mrs. Moore hesitated, her eyes darting to Mrs. Henderson. I cannot recall exactly. It was common knowledge." "Common knowledge based on lies," Gideon said flatly. "Someone in this town deliberately spread false information about my marital status, and as a result, an innocent woman has been slandered, dismissed from her employment, and forced out of her lodging. I want to know who started this rumor." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke. "I will tell you what I think happened," Gideon continued. "I think someone decided that Mrs. Porter represented a threat, perhaps because she is young and attractive. Perhaps because she might catch the eye of a man that someone else had already claimed on his behalf. So this person invented a story that would destroy Mrs. Porter's reputation and drive her out of town." Mrs. Henderson's face hardened. "That is a serious accusation, Mr. Jameson." "Do you have any proof?" "I have the proof of logic. Mrs. Porter arrived in town a month ago. She has conducted herself with complete propriety. The only thing she did wrong was speak to me for 2 minutes on a public street, and for that, her life has been destroyed. The only people who benefit from that are those who want me to remain unattached except for their preferred candidate." Caroline Henderson's face turned scarlet, and she disappeared back into the store. Mrs. Henderson, however, held her ground. "I resent your implication, Mr. Jameson. I have done nothing but try to be a good friend to you. If there has been a misunderstanding about your marital status, I am sure it was an honest mistake. Was it also an honest mistake that you told me just last week that I should stop being so stubborn and accept Caroline's affections? That a good woman like your sister should not have to wait forever for me to come to my senses?" The crowd was silent now, watching the confrontation with rapt attention. Mrs. Henderson's expression turned cold. "My sister is worth 10 of this. This woman who comes to town with no family, no connections, and immediately sets her cap at the most eligible bachelor in Calico. But if you prefer someone of questionable character to a respectable woman, that is your choice. Mrs. Porter's character is beyond reproach," Gideon said, his voice hard. "She is a widow who came here seeking honest work. She spoke to me for exactly one conversation, a conversation that was polite and brief. Everything else is invention and malice." Then why are you defending her so passionately? Mrs. Henderson shot back. If she means nothing to you, why do you care what happens to her? Gideon was silent for a moment, and Delilah felt her breath catch. She had not expected him to take her defense this far, and she certainly had not expected him to do it so publicly. Because, Gideon said slowly, I care about the truth, and because no one deserves to be destroyed by lies. He turned to address the crowd. Mrs. Porter is innocent of any wrongdoing. I am not married, and there was no improper conduct. Anyone who continues to spread these lies or treats her with anything less than respect will answer to me. Is that understood? The crowd murmured assent, though Delilah could see that some faces remained skeptical. Mrs. Henderson drew herself up with dignity. Say what you will, Mr. Jameson. But actions speak louder than words. We will see what Mrs. Porter's true character is in time. She swept back into her store, and the crowd began to disperse. Delilah stood frozen, unsure what to do or say. Gideon had defended her, but at what cost to himself? And what happened now, Mrs. Moore approached them, looking uncomfortable. Mrs. Porter, perhaps I was too hasty in my judgment. If you would like to return to work at the shop, I am willing to reconsider. Delilah looked at the woman who had dismissed her so coldly just a day before. Part of her wanted to refuse out of pride. But she needed the work, and she could not afford to let her emotions dictate her decisions. I will return on Monday, she said quietly. Mrs. Moore nodded and hurried away. Delilah turned to Gideon, searching for words that seemed inadequate. Thank you, she finally managed. You did not have to do that. Yes, I did. What happened to you was wrong, and I will not stand by while innocent people are hurt. He studied her face. Will you be all right? I think so. At least now I have my job back. And your lodging. I will speak with Mrs. Wells. Perhaps she will allow me to stay now that the truth is known. Gideon nodded, but he looked troubled. Mrs. Porter, I need to be honest with you about something. Delilah's heart sank. Here it came, the inevitable withdrawal. He had defended her publicly, done his duty, and now he would politely extract himself from her life. What I said about you meaning nothing to me, Gideon continued, his voice low enough that only she could hear, that was not entirely accurate. She stared at him. I do not understand. The truth is, I noticed you the moment you arrived in town. I have been wanting to speak with you for weeks, but I did not want to seem forward. When we bumped into each other that day, I was happy for the excuse to introduce myself. I have thought about you every day since. Delilah felt heat rising in her cheeks. Mr. Jameson, I am not asking for anything, he said quickly. I just wanted you to know that defending you was not just about justice. It was also personal, but I understand if my attention is unwelcome. You have been through enough without me adding complications to your life. For a long moment, Delilah could not speak. Her world had been turned upside down in the past few days, and she had believed herself alone in facing it. But here was this man, this cowboy who barely knew her, offering something she had not expected, genuine care. Your attention is not unwelcome, she said softly, but I am not sure I am in a position to offer anything in return. My life is still very uncertain. I am not asking for anything you are not ready to give. I just wanted to be honest with you. Gideon smiled, and it transformed his weathered face. But perhaps, when things are more settled, you would allow me to call on you properly. I would like that very much. They stood together in the dusty street, the afternoon sun beating down on them. And for the first time since arriving in Calico, Delilah felt a flutter of hope in her chest. True to her word, Delilah returned to work at the dress shop on Monday. The atmosphere was strained at first, with Mrs. Moore treating her with exaggerated politeness, and the customers watching her with wary curiosity. But Delilah kept her head down and focused on her work, letting her skill with a needle speak for itself. Mrs. Wells had agreed to let her keep her room, though the landlady made it clear she would be watching for any sign of impropriety. Delilah accepted the condition without argument. She was just grateful to have a roof over her head. Gideon did not call on her immediately, and Delilah understood why. He was giving the gossip time to die down, allowing her reputation to stabilize before adding fuel to the fire. But she saw him around town occasionally, and he always tipped his hat and offered a warm smile that made her heart beat faster. 3 weeks after the confrontation in the street, Gideon appeared at the dress shop just as Delilah was finishing for the day. Mrs. Moore watched with narrowed eyes as he approached. "Mrs. Porter, I was wondering if you might like to take a walk with me," he said. "It is a pleasant evening, and I thought you might enjoy seeing the sunset from the ridge." Delilah glanced at Mrs. Moore, who gave a tight nod of permission. "I would enjoy that, Mr. Jameson. Thank you." They walked through town and up a dusty path that led to a low ridge overlooking Calico. The sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed impossible in their vividness. The desert stretched out before them, harsh and beautiful in equal measure. "I have missed talking to you," Gideon said as they walked. "These past weeks have been difficult, knowing you were so close but feeling like I should keep my distance. I understood why you stayed away. You were protecting my reputation. And has it been protected? Are people treating you better?" Delilah considered the question. "They are treating me normally, which is an improvement. I am no longer the scandalous widow, just the seamstress. It is a relief." "Good, that was what I hoped for." Gideon paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Delilah, may I call you Delilah when we are alone?" "Yes." "And I will call you Gideon." He smiled at that. "I want to tell you about myself, so you know who I am before we go any further. I do not have much to offer. I work as a ranch hand at the Double J, which provides me with room, board, and a small wage. I have some money saved, but not enough to call myself prosperous. My family is back in Missouri, but we are not close. I came west 7 years ago looking for adventure and ended up finding hard work instead. That sounds similar to my own story, though I came west out of necessity rather than choice. Tell me about your husband if you are comfortable doing so." Delilah was quiet for a moment, watching the changing colors of the sky. "His name was Thomas. We married young, perhaps too young. He was kind enough, but we were never truly in love. It was more of an arrangement that satisfied both our families. When he died in the mine collapse, I grieved, but not in the way a woman should grieve for the great love of her life. I grieved for the loss of security, for the loneliness of widowhood, for the future that would never be. Is that terrible of me to say? No, it is honest. I appreciate honesty. What about you? Have you ever been in love?" Gideon was quiet for so long that Delilah thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke. "Once, when I was 19. Her name was Elizabeth, and she was the daughter of a merchant in Missouri. We courted for 6 months, and I thought we would marry. Then her father lost his business, and Elizabeth decided she needed a husband with better prospects. She married a banker instead. I am sorry. It was a long time ago, but it taught me something important. I want to marry for love, not for convenience or social standing. I would rather be alone than settle for less than that." They reached the top of the ridge and stood looking out over the desert. The sun touched the horizon, and the world seemed to hold its breath. "Why did you defend me?" Delilah asked suddenly. "You barely knew me. You could have stayed silent and let the gossip run its course." "Because it was wrong, and because even in that brief conversation we had, I saw something in you that intrigued me. A strength beneath the politeness, a determination to survive despite everything the world had thrown at you. I wanted to know more about the woman behind those eyes." Delilah turned to look at him and found him already watching her. The air between them seemed charged with possibility. "I want to court you properly," Gideon said. "If you will allow it. I know the circumstances are not ideal and people will talk, but I do not care about that anymore." "I care about you. I care about you too," Delilah admitted, "but I am frightened. Everything fell apart so quickly before. What if it happens again? Then we will face it together. But I do not think it will. The truth is known now, and Mrs. Henderson has lost her power over us. We can build something real if you are willing to try." Delilah thought about everything she had been through. The death of her husband, the move to Calico, the false accusations, the loneliness that had become her constant companion. She thought about Gideon standing in the street defending her when no one else would. She thought about the way her heart lifted when she saw him, the way the world seemed brighter when he was near. "I am willing to try," she said. Gideon's smile was like sunrise. He took her hand carefully, as if it were something precious. "Then I am the luckiest man in Calico." They stood together on the ridge, watching the sun disappear behind the mountains, and Delilah felt something shift inside her. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt hope not just for survival, but for happiness. The courtship that followed was the talk of Calico, but in a different way than before. People watched with interest rather than scandal as Gideon called on Delilah every Sunday afternoon. They took walks together, attended church services side by side, and gradually became a familiar sight around town. Mrs. Henderson remained cold toward both of them, and Caroline refused to speak to Gideon when their paths crossed. But most of the townspeople seemed to accept the relationship, especially after they saw how Gideon treated Delilah with unfailing respect and tenderness. Delilah found herself falling in love in a way she had never experienced before. With Thomas, it had been comfortable and safe. With Gideon, it was exhilarating and terrifying and wonderful all at once. He made her laugh with stories about his work on the ranch. He listened with genuine interest when she talked about her dreams of one day opening her own dress shop. He brought her wildflowers that he picked from the desert, their colors bright against the muted landscape. And slowly, carefully, he helped her heal from the wounds left by betrayal and loss. 4 months into their courtship, Gideon took Delilah on a picnic to a spot he knew near the mine workings. It was a Sunday afternoon, and the heat of summer had given way to the more tolerable warmth of early autumn. They sat on a blanket beneath the sparse shade of a Joshua tree, eating sandwiches and drinking lemonade while the mountains loomed in the distance. "I have been thinking about the future," Gideon said, setting down his cup. "About what I want my life to look like. And what do you see?" Delilah asked, though her heart was already beginning to race. "I see a home. Not a bunkhouse shared with 5 other men, but a real home. I see a wife who makes me want to be better than I am. I see children someday if we are blessed. I see growing old with someone I love." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. When he opened it, Delilah saw a simple gold band with a small garnet set in the center. "It is not much," Gideon said, and she could hear the nervousness in his voice. "But it is real, just like what I feel for you is real." "Delilah Porter, will you marry me?" Tears spilled down Delilah's cheeks before she could stop them. "Yes, yes, I will marry you." Gideon slipped the ring onto her finger and then he kissed her for the first time. It was gentle and sweet and full of promise, and Delilah felt like her heart might burst from the joy of it. They were married 6 weeks later in the small church on the edge of town. Delilah wore a dress she had made herself, ivory silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Gideon wore his best suit, which he had purchased specially for the occasion. The church was full of people from Calico, most of them genuinely happy for the couple who had overcome so much to be together. Mrs. Henderson and Caroline did not attend, but Delilah found she did not care. She was too busy looking at the man who was becoming her husband, too full of love to have room for bitterness. The ceremony was simple, but heartfelt. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Gideon kissed Delilah with such tenderness that several women in the congregation wiped their eyes. They had no money for a grand wedding trip, so they spent their first night as a married couple in a small house that Gideon had been renting at the edge of town. It was not much, just 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it was theirs. Gideon carried Delilah over the threshold, and they laughed together at the awkwardness of it. That night, as they lay together in the darkness, Delilah felt a peace she had never known. This was what love was supposed to feel like, safe and passionate, comfortable and exciting, all at the same time. "Are you happy?" Gideon whispered against her hair. "Happier than I ever thought possible. Good, because I plan to spend the rest of my life making sure you stay that way." Life as Mrs. Gideon Jameson settled into a comfortable rhythm. Delilah continued working at the dress shop, though now she was saving money toward her dream of opening her own establishment. Gideon worked long hours at the Double J Ranch, but he always came home to her in the evenings, and they would sit together on their small porch watching the desert sunset. They were not wealthy, but they were content. They had enough to eat, a roof over their heads and each other. It was more than many people had, and they were grateful for it. 5 months after their wedding, Delilah began to feel queasy in the mornings. At first, she attributed it to something she had eaten, but when the nausea persisted for 2 weeks, she began to suspect the truth. A visit to the town doctor confirmed it. She was expecting a child. Gideon's reaction when she told him was everything she could have hoped for. He picked her up and spun her around despite her protests, his face split by a grin so wide it looked like it might break. "We are going to be parents," he kept saying, as if he could not quite believe it. "We are going to have a baby." "You are happy then?" Delilah asked, though his reaction made the question unnecessary. "Happy, Delilah, I am beyond happy. I am ecstatic. I am terrified. I am the luckiest man alive." They told no one at first, wanting to savor the secret between them. But as Delilah's waist began to thicken and her dresses required letting out, the news became public knowledge. The women of Calico were uniformly pleased, even Mrs. Moore, who gave Delilah an extra day off each week to rest. Only Mrs. Henderson seemed immune to the general happiness. She passed Delilah on the street one day when Delilah was 6 months pregnant and could no longer hide her condition. "I suppose you think you have one," Mrs. Henderson said coldly. Delilah stopped, surprised by the venom in the older woman's voice. "I was not aware we were in competition. You took him from Caroline. She could have made him happy, could have given him a respectable life. Instead, he chose you. He chose love," Delilah said quietly, "and I chose him." There was no winning or losing, Mrs. Henderson. There were just 2 people who found each other despite the obstacles put in their way. She walked on before Mrs. Henderson could respond, refusing to let the woman's bitterness taint her joy. The baby came in the spring of 1884, on a warm April evening when the desert was in bloom with wildflowers. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Delilah was certain she would not survive it. But Gideon stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and whispering encouragement even when the pain made her want to scream. Finally, after 14 hours, their son was born. He came into the world with a lusty cry that announced his arrival to anyone within earshot. The doctor cleaned him up and placed him in Delilah's arms, and she looked down at the small, red-faced creature with overwhelming love. "He is perfect," she whispered. "He is beautiful," Gideon agreed, though the baby looked like a wrinkled old man. "What shall we name him?" They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had never quite decided. Now, looking at their son, Delilah knew exactly what his name should be. Samuel Thomas Jameson. "After your first husband?" Gideon asked, surprised. "Thomas was not a bad man, just not the right man for me. But he was part of my story, part of what brought me here to you. I want to honor that." Gideon kissed her forehead. "Samuel Thomas Jameson it is." Being parents transformed their lives in ways both exhausting and wonderful. Samuel was a demanding baby, waking frequently in the night and requiring constant attention. But watching him grow, seeing Gideon's face light up when he held his son, made every sleepless night worthwhile. Delilah had to reduce her hours at the dress shop, but she began taking on work from home, sewing late at night after Samuel was asleep. She was still saving for her own shop, and she refused to let that dream die just because circumstances had changed. Gideon proved to be a devoted father. He would come home from long days at the ranch and immediately reach for Samuel, cooing at the baby with a tenderness that made Delilah's heart melt. He changed diapers without complaint, walked the floor with Samuel when he was fussy, and sang off-key lullabies that somehow always put the baby to sleep. "I never knew I could love someone this much," Gideon confessed one night as they stood over Samuel's cradle, watching him sleep. "I thought what I felt for you was the limit of my heart, but this little one has expanded it even further." "I know what you mean," Delilah said, leaning against her husband's solid warmth. "Sometimes I look at him and I am overwhelmed by how much I love him. It is frightening and wonderful at the same time. We made him together. We created a life. That is the most amazing thing in the world." As Samuel grew from an infant to a toddler, Calico itself was changing. The silver mines that had brought prosperity were beginning to play out, and some families were leaving to seek their fortunes elsewhere. The Double J Ranch where Gideon worked remained stable, but there was an underlying sense of uncertainty about the town's future. Delilah and Gideon discussed what this meant for them. Should they stay in Calico, or should they consider moving to a larger town with more opportunities? In the end, they decided to stay, at least for now. Calico was their home, the place where they had met and fallen in love. They would not abandon it without good reason. When Samuel was 2 years old, Delilah discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she knew what to expect. She continued working until she was 8 months along, then reluctantly agreed to rest for the final weeks. Their daughter was born on a cold December night in 1886, coming into the world so quickly that Gideon barely had time to fetch the doctor. She was smaller than Samuel had been, but just as loud, her cries echoing through their little house. "What shall we name her?" Gideon asked, cradling the tiny girl with practiced ease. Grace Elizabeth Jameson." Delilah looked at her husband. "Elizabeth for the girl you once loved, just as Samuel carries Thomas's name. Our past made us who we are, and I want our children to carry that with them." Gideon's eyes were suspiciously bright. "You are an extraordinary woman, Delilah Jameson." "I am simply a woman in love with her husband and her children." Samuel was fascinated by his baby sister, insisting on helping with everything from diaper changes to bath time. He would sit beside her cradle for hours, babbling to her in his limited vocabulary and bringing her his favorite toys. "He is going to be a good big brother," Gideon observed one evening. "He takes after his father," Delilah replied, smiling at her husband. Life with 2 small children was chaotic and exhausting, but Delilah had never been happier. She had the family she had always wanted, the love she had never expected to find, and a future that looked bright despite the uncertainty facing Calico. When Grace was 6 months old, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Moore approached Delilah with a business proposition. "I am getting older," the shop owner said bluntly. "My hands ache from the stitching, and my eyes are not what they once were. I want to retire, but I do not want to simply close the shop. You are the best seamstress I have ever employed, Delilah. Would you be interested in buying the business from me?" Delilah was stunned. "I have been saving, but I do not have enough to purchase a shop outright. I am not asking for payment all at once. We can arrange terms, with you paying me a portion of the profits each month until the debt is settled. What do you say?" It was the opportunity Delilah had been dreaming of since before she came to Calico. She discussed it with Gideon that evening, and he encouraged her to accept. "You have worked so hard for this," he said. "You should take it. We will make it work." So Delilah became the owner of the dress shop, renaming it Delilah's Fine Dressmaking. She hired another seamstress to help with the workload and gradually built a reputation that drew customers from surrounding towns. The business prospered, and within 2 years, she had paid off Mrs. more completely. The children grew. Samuel started school and proved to be a quick learner, always coming home with stories about his day. Grace was a spirited little girl who kept everyone on their toes with her endless energy and curiosity. Gideon was promoted to foreman at the Double J Ranch, which came with a significant increase in pay and more regular hours. With their combined income, they were able to move to a larger house with 3 bedrooms and a proper yard where the children could play. Life was good, better than either of them had dared to hope when they first met on that dusty street in Calico. One afternoon in 1891, 7 years after their wedding, Delilah was working in the dress shop when the bell above the door chimed. She looked up to see Mrs. Henderson entering, looking considerably older and more frail than she had in years past. "Mrs. Henderson," Delilah said carefully, "how may I help you?" The older woman approached the counter slowly. "I need a new dress for my husband's funeral. He passed away 3 days ago." "I am very sorry for your loss," Delilah said sincerely. She had heard about Nate Henderson's death but had not known whether to send condolences given their history. "Thank you." Mrs. Henderson paused, seeming to struggle with something. "I also came to apologize." Delilah set down the fabric she had been holding. "I beg your pardon. I owe you an apology for what I did to you when you first came to Calico, for the rumors I spread and the pain I caused. I did it because I was so certain that you were wrong for Gideon that Caroline would have been better. But I was wrong. I can see that now. What changed your mind, watching you over the years, seeing the way Gideon looks at you, the way you have built a life together, the way your children are thriving? You have everything Caroline could never have given him because you actually love him. I let ambition and pride blind me to that truth, and I am sorry." Delilah was silent for a moment, processing this unexpected apology. Part of her wanted to hold onto her anger, to remind Mrs. Henderson of just how much damage her actions had caused. But another part, the part that had grown and healed over the years with Gideon's love, was ready to let it go. "I accept your apology," Delilah said quietly. "What you did hurt me deeply, but it also brought Gideon and me together. Without those accusations, he might never have defended me. We might never have fallen in love. So in a strange way, I suppose I should thank you." Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with tears. "You are kinder than I deserve. Perhaps. But I have learned that holding on to bitterness only hurts the person carrying it. I forgive you, Mrs. Henderson. Truly." They spoke for a few more minutes about the dress Mrs. Henderson needed, and when the older woman left, Delilah felt as though a weight she had not realized she was carrying had been lifted from her shoulders. That evening, she told Gideon about the encounter. "I am proud of you," he said, pulling her close. "It takes strength to forgive someone who hurt you that deeply. I could not have done it without you. You taught me what real love looks like, and that made forgiveness possible. We taught each other, Gideon corrected. You showed me that I could trust again, that not every woman was like Elizabeth. We saved each other, Delilah. They stood together on their porch, watching their children play in the yard as the sun set over the desert. Samuel was 9 now, tall and lanky, pushing 5-year-old Grace on the swing Gideon had built. Their laughter carried on the evening air, clear and joyful. You ever think about that day we met? Delilah asked. When we bumped into each other outside the mercantile, all the time. It was the best accident of my life. Everything that happened after, the accusations and the pain, it all led us here. To this moment, this life. I would not change any of it. Neither would I. The years continued to pass, bringing both challenges and joys. Calico's fortunes continued to decline as the silver ran out. But Delilah's dress shop remained successful because she had built a customer base that extended far beyond the town's boundaries. Gideon's position at the ranch remained secure, and they were able to provide a comfortable life for their children. Samuel grew into a thoughtful young man who wanted to be a teacher. Grace was artistic and creative, spending hours drawing and painting. Delilah encouraged both children to pursue their passions, determined that they would have opportunities she had never had. In 1895, when Samuel was 11 and Grace was 7, Delilah discovered she was pregnant again. The pregnancy was a surprise, as she had assumed her childbearing years were behind her. But it was a welcome surprise, and both she and Gideon were thrilled at the prospect of another child. Their third child, a son they named Daniel, was born in early 1896. He was a calm, easy baby, so different from the high-energy Samuel and Grace that Delilah sometimes wondered if they had gotten someone else's child by mistake. "He is perfect," Gideon said, holding the infant with the same wonder he had shown with their first 2 children. "All of our children are perfect. We are very blessed," Delilah agreed, with 3 children, a thriving business, and a marriage that grew stronger with each passing year. Delilah often found herself reflecting on how different her life had turned out from what she had expected. If someone had told her, on that day she arrived in Calico with nothing but a carpetbag and a heart full of grief, that she would find love, build a family, and create a successful business, she would not have believed them. But it had all happened, one day at a time, one choice at a time. One evening in 1898, as they celebrated their 14th wedding anniversary, Gideon presented Delilah with a gift, a leather-bound journal with her name embossed on the cover. "What is this for?" she asked, running her fingers over the smooth leather. "For your story, for our story. I want you to write it all down, everything that happened from the day you arrived in Calico to now. So our children and their children will know where they came from, so they will understand that good things can come from difficult beginnings." Delilah opened the journal to the first blank page. "What should I write first?" "Start with the truth. The whispers started the moment you stepped off the stagecoach." So she did. Delilah began writing their story, chronicling the accusations, the defense, the courtship, and the love that had sustained them through everything. She wrote late at night after the children were asleep, filling page after page with memories both painful and beautiful. As she wrote, she realized something important. Their story was not just about overcoming adversity. It was about the power of truth, the importance of standing up for what was right, and the transformative nature of genuine love. The years continued to unfold. Samuel left home to attend the Teachers' College in Los Angeles, writing long letters home about his studies and his plans for the future. Grace developed into a talented artist, eventually opening a small studio where she taught drawing and painting to local children. Daniel, as he grew, proved to have his father's steady temperament and his mother's eye for detail, eventually apprenticing with a carpenter in town. Delilah's dress shop continued to thrive, even as Calico itself shrank around it. Many families left for more prosperous towns, but those who remained were fiercely loyal to the businesses that had stayed. The shop became a gathering place for women, a spot where they could share news and support each other through good times and bad. Gideon worked at the Double J Ranch for 23 years before the owner, getting old himself, offered to sell him a portion of the land. With their combined savings and a loan from the bank, Gideon and Delilah purchased 50 acres and started their own small ranch. It was modest compared to the Double J, but it was theirs. They raised cattle and horses, with Gideon handling the livestock while Delilah managed the business side. It was hard work, but they had never been afraid of hard work, and they had each other, which made even the difficult days bearable. In 1905, Samuel returned to Calico with his new wife, a teacher he had met in Los Angeles. They settled in town, and Samuel took a position at the local school. Within a year, he and his wife welcomed a daughter, making Delilah and Gideon grandparents for the first time. Holding her granddaughter for the first time, Delilah was overwhelmed with emotion. This tiny girl was the continuation of everything she and Gideon had built together. She was proof that love could create something lasting, something that would endure long after they were gone. "What are you thinking?" Gideon asked, standing beside her as she rocked the baby. "I am thinking about how far we have come. About how none of this would exist if you had not stood up in that street and told the truth. You saved me, Gideon. You saved us both. You would have survived without me. You are the strongest person I know. Perhaps, but I would not have thrived. I would not have loved. You gave me that gift, and I will never stop being grateful for it." Grace married a few years later, a young journalist who had come to Calico to write a story about the dying mining towns of California. They moved to San Francisco, where Grace continued her art and raised 3 children who visited their grandparents every summer. Daniel stayed in Calico, taking over the carpentry business when his mentor retired. He married a local girl, and they built a house on a corner of Delilah and Gideon's ranch, keeping the family close. As Delilah and Gideon grew older, they watched their children and grandchildren with pride and joy. Their little house at the edge of town had been sold years ago, replaced by the ranch house they built together. It was larger and more comfortable, with enough room for all their children and grandchildren when they came to visit. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1914, their family gathered for a celebration. Samuel and his wife came with their 3 children. Grace and her husband traveled from San Francisco with their brood. Daniel and his wife were already there, living on the ranch. The house was full of noise and laughter and love. After dinner, as the grandchildren played outside and the adults relaxed on the porch, Samuel stood to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who taught me that true love is not just romance but partnership. That it is standing beside someone through hardship and joy. That it is building a life together one day at a time. You have given us the greatest gift possible, an example of what marriage should be. Thank you." Everyone raised their glasses, and Delilah felt tears streaming down her cheeks. She looked at Gideon, who was also crying unabashedly, and they shared a smile that held 30 years of memories. "Speech," someone called out, and the family took up the chant. "Speech, speech." Gideon stood slowly, his joints protesting after years of hard ranch work. He was 62 now, his hair completely gray and his face deeply lined. But his eyes were still the same warm brown that had caught Delilah's attention all those years ago. "I am not much for speeches," he began, his voice rough with emotion. But I will say this. Everything good in my life came from one moment of decision. The moment I chose to stand up and tell the truth, even though it would have been easier to stay silent. That choice brought me Delilah, and Delilah brought me all of you. So my advice to you is this. Always stand up for what is right, even when it is difficult. Always defend those who cannot defend themselves, and always, always choose love over fear. He sat down to applause, and Delilah reached for his hand. They sat together, surrounded by the family they had created, and watched the sun set over the desert they had called home for more than 3 decades. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Delilah and Gideon sat together on their porch as they had done countless times before. The desert air was cool and clear, filled with the scent of sage and the distant sound of coyotes calling to each other. "You remember what you said to me the day we got engaged?" Delilah asked. "About seeing a future with a home and a wife and children." "I remember." "Did it turn out the way you imagined?" Gideon was quiet for a moment, thinking. "It turned out better. I imagined happiness, but I could not have imagined this depth of joy. I could not have imagined loving someone more with each passing year, even though I thought I already loved you completely. I could not have imagined the pride I would feel watching our children grow into good people, or the delight of holding our grandchildren. I feel the same way. My life before you seems like a faded photograph, something I can barely remember. My real life began the day you defended me." Our real life began together. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had weathered storms and celebrated triumphs side by side. Delilah thought about the journal she had filled with their story, now complete and waiting to be passed down to future generations. She thought about the dress shop she still ran, though she had taken on more help in recent years. She thought about the ranch, the land that would stay in their family long after they were gone. But mostly, she thought about the man beside her, the cowboy who had seen the truth when everyone else saw only lies. The man who had stood in the street and defended her honor when he had nothing to gain and everything to lose. The man who had loved her faithfully for 3 decades and counting. "Gideon," she said softly. "Yes, my love, thank you for telling the truth." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Thank you for being worth telling the truth for." They continued to sit together as the stars emerged in the vast desert sky. Two souls bound together by love and strengthened by time. The accusations that had once threatened to destroy Delilah were now nothing more than a distant memory, a storm that had passed and left something beautiful in its wake. The years that followed were gentler, filled with the quiet joys of grandparenthood and the satisfaction of watching their legacy unfold. Delilah eventually passed the dress shop to a young woman she had trained, content to spend her days on the ranch with Gideon. They worked together in the garden, rode horses across their land, and welcomed a steady stream of grandchildren who came to hear stories about the old days. In 1920, as they celebrated their 36th wedding anniversary, Delilah and Gideon took a wagon ride out to the ridge where Gideon had proposed all those years ago. They moved more slowly now, their bodies showing the wear of hard work and long years, but their love had not diminished. "Do you ever regret staying in Calico?" Gideon asked as they looked out over the landscape that had barely changed in 4 decades. "We could have gone anywhere, done anything. I have never regretted a single day of my life with you. Calico is where our story began, and it is where it should continue. This place made us who we are." "You made me who I am," Gideon corrected gently. "You taught me that love is not about grand gestures, but about showing up every day and choosing each other over and over again." We taught each other. As the sun set, painting the sky in those impossible shades of orange and pink that seemed unique to the desert, They held hands and watched in companionable silence. They had seen thousands of sunsets together, but each one still felt special, still reminded them of the beauty that existed in simple moments shared with someone you loved. When they returned to the ranch house that evening, they found their children and grandchildren waiting for them, having planned a surprise party. The house was decorated with ribbons and flowers, and the table groaned under the weight of food everyone had brought to share. As Delilah looked around at the faces of the people she and Gideon had created, directly or indirectly, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. Her life could have been so different if Mrs. Henderson's lies had succeeded in driving her from Calico, if Gideon had not chosen to defend her, if she had given up in the face of adversity. Any of those things could have led to a different outcome. But instead, she had found love. She had built a family. She had created a life worth living. "What are you thinking about?" Gideon whispered, leaning close. "I am thinking that I am the luckiest woman in the world. I think I am the lucky one. Then we are both lucky and blessed beyond measure." They danced together that night, moving slowly to music played on a phonograph Daniel had purchased in town. Delilah rested her head on Gideon's shoulder and closed her eyes, letting herself be transported back to their wedding day when they had been young and uncertain but full of hope. That hope had been rewarded 1,000-fold. As the years continued to pass, Calico changed around them. The town that had once bustled with miners and prospectors became quieter, more settled. Many of the original buildings fell into disrepair, but those that remained were well tended by people who had chosen to make this desert town their permanent home. The ranch prospered under Gideon's careful management and Delilah's shrewd business sense. They passed more land to Daniel, who expanded the operation and brought in new cattle breeds. The Jameson name became synonymous with quality livestock, and buyers came from as far as Los Angeles to purchase their animals. Delilah continued to sew, though now it was quilts for grandchildren and small clothing for great-grandchildren rather than elaborate dresses for paying customers. Her fingers were not as nimble as they once had been, but she found peace in the familiar rhythm of needle and thread. Gideon's body bore the marks of a life spent working outdoors. His joints ached on cold mornings, and he moved with the careful deliberation of age. But he still rose before dawn to check on the cattle, still insisted on doing a full day's work despite Daniel's protests that he should rest more. "I will have plenty of time to rest when I am dead," Gideon would say with a grin. "While I am alive, I intend to keep living." In 1925, they celebrated their 41st wedding anniversary surrounded by 3 children, 9 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. Delilah was 68 years old, Gideon 65. They had lived longer than many people did in those harsh times, and they were grateful for every additional day granted to them. That night, as they prepared for bed, Gideon pulled Delilah into his arms and held her close. "I love you," he said simply. "I have loved you from the moment I first saw you, and I will love you beyond the end of my days. And I love you. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." They climbed into bed together, fitting against each other the way they had for more than 4 decades. Delilah listened to the steady rhythm of Gideon's breathing and felt a profound contentment settle over her. This was what mattered, not wealth or status or what other people thought. What mattered was love freely given and gratefully received. What mattered was standing up for truth even when lies were easier. What mattered was building a life of meaning with someone who saw you clearly and loved you anyway. As sleep claimed her, Delilah's last thought was of that young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Calico all those years ago. That frightened widow with her worn carpetbag and her uncertain future. If she could go back and tell that woman what lay ahead, she would say only this: have faith. The hard times will pass and something beautiful is waiting just around the corner. Gideon passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1927, 3 months before what would have been their 43rd wedding anniversary. Delilah woke to find him still and quiet beside her, his face relaxed in what looked like a peaceful dream. She held his hand and wept, mourning the loss of her partner, her love, her best friend. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half of California. People came from San Francisco and Los Angeles, from small towns and large ranches, all of them touched in some way by Gideon Jameson's life. They told stories about his integrity, his kindness, his unwavering commitment to doing what was right. "He saved my mother's life once," one man said, "by standing up for her when no one else would. He taught me what it means to be a man of honor." Delilah sat surrounded by her children and grandchildren, accepting condolences and remembering. She remembered the day they met, the day he defended her, the day he proposed. She remembered their wedding, the birth of each child, every anniversary and birthday and ordinary day they had shared. She remembered being loved. After the funeral, Delilah returned to the ranch house that felt empty without Gideon's presence. Her children wanted her to come live with one of them, but she refused. This was her home, filled with memories of the life she and Gideon had built together. She would not abandon it. The months that followed were difficult. Delilah had been widowed before, but losing Gideon was different. Thomas's death had left her uncertain and afraid. Gideon's death left her heartbroken but not broken. She had loved deeply and been loved in return, and that was something no one could take from her. She spent her days tending the garden, sewing quilts and writing in a new journal. She recorded memories of Gideon, stories she wanted preserved for future generations. She wrote about his courage, his gentleness, his ability to see the truth when others saw only lies. And she wrote about love, not the romantic, idealized love of fairy tales, but the real, messy, glorious love that sustained people through hardship and joy. The love that chose commitment over convenience, truth over comfort, partnership over independence. On what would have been their 43rd wedding anniversary, Delilah made the journey to the ridge where Gideon had proposed. She sat on the blanket she had brought and watched the sun set over the desert, remembering the young woman and the cowboy who had fallen in love in this very spot. "I miss you," she said aloud, not caring if anyone heard. "Every day I miss you, but I am not sorry. I would rather have loved you and lost you than never loved you at all. You gave me the greatest gift possible, a life filled with meaning and purpose and joy. Thank you, my love. Thank you for everything." As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Delilah felt a peace settle over her. Gideon was gone, but their love remained. It lived in their children and grandchildren, in the ranch they had built, in the stories that would be passed down through generations. It lived in her heart, where it would stay until the day she joined him again. Delilah lived for 3 more years, surrounded by family and filled with purpose. She saw another great-grandchild born, taught her granddaughters to sew, and shared stories about Gideon until everyone knew exactly the kind of man he had been. When she died in her sleep in the summer of 1930, at the age of 73, it was discovered that she had left detailed instructions for her funeral. She wanted to be buried beside Gideon, on a hill overlooking the ranch where they had spent so many happy years. And she wanted a particular passage read at her service, something she had written herself. Samuel, now a gray-haired man in his 50s, stood before the assembled mourners and read his mother's words. "I came to Calico with nothing but a widow's grief and a carpet-bag full of hope. I found accusations and lies, cruelty and suspicion. But I also found truth and courage and love. I found a man who saw me clearly and loved me anyway. A man who stood in the street and defended my honor when he had nothing to gain from it. A man who became my husband, my partner, my best friend, and the father of my children. I have lived a blessed life, not because it was easy, but because it was shared. To anyone reading this, choose love, choose truth, stand up for what is right even when it costs you. The rewards are worth more than you can imagine. There was not a dry eye in the crowd. People remembered Delilah Porter Jameson as a strong woman who had overcome adversity to build a successful business and raise a good family. They remembered her kindness, her integrity, and her unwavering love for the cowboy who had defended her. But more than anything, they remembered her story, the story of a woman accused and a cowboy who knew the truth. The story of two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from the ashes of lies and malice. The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through Daniel to his children and eventually his grandchildren. The dress shop became a historical landmark, preserved as a reminder of Calico's more prosperous days. And the story of Delilah and Gideon became legend, told and retold until it was hard to separate fact from embellishment. But the core truth remained unchanged. A cowboy had stood up for a woman he barely knew because it was the right thing to do. And in doing so, he had changed both their lives forever. Years later, when Delilah and Gideon's great-great-grandchildren visited the family ranch, they would stand on the ridge where their ancestors had fallen in love and watch the sun set over the desert. They would read from the journals Delilah had kept, marveling at the story of courage and love that had made their existence possible. And they would understand that the best things in life come not from taking the easy path, but from standing up for truth and choosing love even when the world tries to tear it down. That legacy, more than land or money or possessions, was the true inheritance Delilah and Gideon had left behind. Their story, their love, their example, these were the gifts that would endure long after the buildings crumbled and the names on the gravestones faded. These were the things that mattered, the things that lasted, the things that transformed ordinary lives into something extraordinary. And it all began with a cowboy who knew the truth and had the courage to tell it to the town.